Susan Watts. Well, in a moment, I'll be talking to the International Development Secretary, Douglas Alexander. But first, I'm joined by Tom Picken of Friends of the Earth and from Oxford by the economist Vijay Joshi, a former advisor to the Indian government. Vijay Joshi, first of all, what's the chance of India signing up to a deal on climate change in Copenhagen?
I think the chances are absolutely zero unless there's much more on the table than appears to be the case right now.
What do you want on the table?
Well, on the table, I think what India would want is that the growth of living standards in India shouldn't be affected adversely for let us say a couple of decades, because by then one hopes that abject poverty will have disappeared.
Well, let's move from the developing world to the developed world, Tom Picken. 80% of cuts in emissions by 2050 by the developed world looks pretty good.
Well, these targets, we have to remember, are mid-century. They are so far off that they're pretty meaningless at the moment. What we need is short-term reductions. The science is absolutely clear that we need emissions in the order of at least 40% from the industrialized countries.
And we've got 20 at the moment,
10 years. The targets on the table are completely inadequate and are being further watered down through certain mechanisms like offsetting, which
But do you understand India's predicament? I mean, do you agree with India's predicament?
The central foundations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are about preventing dangerous climate change and supporting economic development of developing countries. The developed world has to step up and provide the finance necessary and take the leadership in the reductions.
Vijay Joshi, could the developed world help you through technology transfer or indeed money? We heard from the film there that it would be hundreds of billions a year.
I think that's right. It would have to be hundreds of billions a year if reduction in living standards is to be avoided. The thing about technology is that people talk about it, but actually it isn't available. I mean, India depends on coal and oil, and to have carbon capture and sequestration, well, the technology just isn't there. And at the moment, and when it comes, it will probably be twice as expensive as what's available now. So yes, one would need a lot of technology transfer, but that isn't enough. There would have to be a lot of financial transfer one way or the other.
Tom Picken, John Prescott says there is a need for a plan B within the next 100 days. That's realistic, isn't it?
We have to be careful that Plan B doesn't become a plan of failure to achieve what the government has committed itself to avoid dangerous climate change. The main obstacle currently in the negotiations is clearly the inaction of the industrialized countries to make the commitments that are necessary to avoid dangerous climate change and provide the finance to support international efforts to leapfrog dirty development.
And do you think there is likely to be what's called a political surge?
We really need that political surge. We need the action from the industrialized leaders to make this work.
Thank you both very much. Now we can turn to Douglas Alexander, who is in our Glasgow studio. Douglas Alexander, what's needed is a political surge. John Prescott says the developed world is not doing enough and the developing world is being asked to do too much.
Well, I agree that we need a political surge, and in Britain we've been urging others to take that role. I think there is a degree of psychology involved. I don't think we should enter these negotiations anticipating failure, so we should be working on Plan A. But we can also draw comfort from the fact that the Chinese and the American administrations are clearly committed to securing a deal. But it's never going to be easy securing a deal of 180 or more countries in December. And that's why the lesson that I draw from the G20 process so successfully prosecuted in London back in April is you need high-level political engagement early. We can't simply leave this to the technical negotiators. That's why we do need the G20, when it meets in Pittsburgh next month, to take the lead with the finance ministers and try and drive this agenda forward.
But it looks as if India is very much up in the ante, because Vijay Joshi is close to the government, has worked for the government, and he says, and other economists we've spoken today say there's no chance of India signing up the deal as it is constituted just now.
Well, I'll be in a better position to judge that on Tuesday and Wednesday next week when I'll be in Delhi with Ed Miliband, the Climate Change Secretary, as we discuss with the Indian government the relationship between poverty reduction, which is critical to the Congress Party and to the Indian government, and the critical need to secure India's agreement to get a successful outcome at Copenhagen. Frankly, there isn't a trade-off between poverty reduction and climate change unless we get a global deal in climate change in Copenhagen. then climate change will make poverty the future for billions of our fellow citizens around the world.
But you heard our contributor there saying technology transfer is just not up to it. It's not going to be up to the game, and when it comes along, it's going to be too expensive.
I agree technology transfer alone is not the answer. I think amidst all the complexity, there are two really big challenges. Firstly, we need to get the right financing deal to make sure that the developing world secures the funds that are needed to make those technology transfers and to adapt to the inevitable climate change which is already occurring. At the same time, we do need to have both long-term and intermediate targets if we're actually going to see the progress that what the scientists tell us we need to see over the coming decades. So whether it's getting those targets led by the science, whether it's getting those financial flows into the developing world, I think that will be the essence of the negotiations in December. And it's why I welcome the fact that it was the British government a couple of months back who were really the first government in the world to set out the kind of financial figures we're talking about, because the guts of this negotiation in December is going to turn on financing and on intermediate and long-term targets.
Well, you talk about intermediate targets, and today India's Environment Minister challenged the developed world, said UK, for example, had signed up to 20% reduction by 2020, make it 40, and make it 40 and call our bluff.
Well, listen, these are going to be the negotiations. We've got the long-term target in 2050 of 80%. We've already said 20%, which is the common European target. The European Union said that would move to 30% if we get the global deal. So this is the very stuff of the negotiations. But I think the challenge immediately is to work with the kind of protesters that we saw at the beginning of the programme, with distinguished parliamentarians like John Prescott, who have got a lot of experience of negotiating these matters, and build a constituency of support to get the agreement in Copenhagen that's needed, both in the developing and in the developed world, and then let the negotiators resolve these key issues of financing and the intermediate targets led by the science.
But the trouble is that when it looks like the baseline from which you're starting, the G8 couldn't even agree on that. Was it 1999? Was it 2005? What was it? The G8 can't agree. What chances are there of people, as you say, in Copenhagen agreeing?
Well, as I said at the beginning, there's more than 180 countries, but the need to get this agreement is going to affect every one of those countries. In terms of the G8, the point I would make would be in L'Aquila, where the outcome, let's be honest, of that summit was limited. There was a very significant prize in relation to climate change, which was a general acceptance of 2 degrees being the limit of what is acceptable in terms of climate change. Now that we have that agreement that the science is the foundation, that does actually move us forward, looking ahead both to the finance ministers' meeting in Pittsburgh next month and then looking ahead to the Conference of the Parties in December.
At the beginning you said that it would be defeatist to go for anything other than a plan A, but is it not realist to have a plan B up your sleeve?
Well, I honestly think that we can draw significant strength from the commitment of the United States, the commitment of China, and the fact that all the evidence indicates that you are better placed to secure an agreement through an organisation like the United Nations than through any other body. I spent 8 days in Geneva last year trying to get a trade deal, and the lesson is that if you fail in these major international conferences, you don't get a more progressive alternative the next month or the next year. The fact is we have a huge amount hanging in the balance at the moment. The citizens of Britain and the citizens of India united in that. That's why I do think all of our efforts in the months ahead shouldn't be about saying, what do we do if we fail, but working, planning and building for success.
All right, thanks much indeed, Douglas Alexander.